Another flipped lecture. Today's topic is the Cold War abroad, the United States versus the Soviet Union. We will be discussing the early years of the Cold War and how the Soviet Union and the United States interacted. To begin with, let's talk about how the Allied powers started planning for post-World War II. They actually started planning before the war was even over, when it seemed pretty sure that Germany was on its way down. The Allied leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, met in Yalta in February of 1945 to discuss what would happen when the war finally was over. And they made a few decisions at this meeting. One thing that they decided to do was that after the war, the European nations that had been ruled by Hitler during the war would end up being democratic. Of course, Stalin had a different idea of this, and although he agreed to it at the meeting, he did not follow through. They also created the United Nations in the hope that they would be able to promote and keep world peace after the war. This was much like the League of Nations, except countries actually participated and enforced what the United Nations did, and that's why it's still around today. Other decisions at the Yalta meeting, $20 billion in reparations were going to come from Germany, and a half would go to Russia, who had been hit pretty hard in the war. Also, Russia would get the eastern part of Poland to build up defenses, and land would be taken from East Germany to compensate Poland. Now, when the war actually did end, they had another meeting. This was at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. And I should say the war in Europe was over. Potsdam is a town located near Berlin. And again, the leaders from the different Allied countries met. And the big decision here was what to do with Germany. And it was agreed that they needed to rebuild it. They needed to set up a new government. And so they decided that at first Germany would be divided into 4 zones. The United States would have one. The Soviet Union would have another, Great Britain and France would each occupy one, until the country could be rebuilt. Now, at this meeting as well, Stalin was told that America had a new weapon. Remember, this is right before the atomic bomb was dropped. But very little information was actually given to Stalin, and he didn't know it was actually the atomic bomb until he heard the news report. So when the bombs were dropped, Stalin realized that America had superior technology. But the United States also knew that Soviets had massive conventional forces in the form of their Red Army. This led to increased tension and problems and issues during the Cold War. Okay, so after the war in Eastern Europe, Stalin desperately wanted to create some sort of a protective barrier around the Soviet Union. He felt like he should be able to do this as no nation in Europe had suffered the devastation they had as a result of the Nazis. This protective barrier, Stalin felt, would make sure that any future war would cause damage in places other than the Soviet Union. And how did he do this? How did he basically take over and create satellite states, countries that were loyal to him and that instituted communist governments? Some of it was through intimidation. People were killed if they stood up against the new system and communism. He also used a lot of propaganda to try and sell his ideas to people in these other nations. And, you know, after World War II was over, these countries and these people were very poor. They wanted jobs and food. So to a lot of them, communism sounded okay. So these Eastern European nations that you can see on the map became communist and basically controlled by the Soviets. There were a couple of instances where it was more force was used in order to get the cooperation. For instance, in Poland, all non-communist leaders were killed. There was a, air quote, election in 1947 where 400 out of 450 seats were won by communists, and these were people handpicked that were loyal to Moscow. In Hungary, although the small Farmers' Party won the large majority of political positions, they all mysteriously left politics, basically because of fear that their lives were at stake. Romania election in 1946 in November, the communists won. In Bulgaria, again, non-communist leaders were killed. In October of 1946, communists won a massive victory. Here is a political cartoon that shows what Stalin was doing. Basically, what Churchill said was he was creating an iron curtain. And this quote from Churchill he actually gave in the United States to try and get Americans to see how serious this was of what Stalin was doing to enlarge his power. He said, "From Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, an iron curtain has descended over Europe." Basically, that the eastern part of Europe was divided from the western part, communist versus democracies. Because of this, there were many people in the United States government concerned about Stalin's growing influence in Europe. One of them was George Kennan, and he came up with something called the containment policy. And that was, he said that U.S. foreign policy should focus on preventing the spread of Soviet communism. This containment policy shaped much of the Cold War and was the reason for some of our actions in the Cold War, such as the war in Korea and Vietnam. In 1947, further attempts were made to stop Stalin's aggressive takeover of Eastern European countries. This was in direct response to a communist takeover attempt in Greece. This ultimately failed. It went on for about 3 years, but it inspired Truman to give economic aid to countries that were fighting communism, with the thought that if these countries, who were so poor after the war, actually had resources to stand up to Stalin, that maybe they wouldn't fall to communism. This meant he gave $400 million in aid to both Greece and Turkey that were threatened by communist takeovers. And this was pretty controversial because some Americans felt that we were interfering with the internal affairs of other nations, or that Americans' power would be spread too thin, or that we would be helping out what admittedly was an already corrupt government in Greece. And that's a common theme of the Cold War, is that a lot of times we were helping out countries just to prevent communism from spreading, but their governments themselves were certainly not democracies. The next step in the Cold War and in trying to prevent further influence of Stalin was something called the Marshall Plan. And this was created by the Secretary of State, George Marshall. He argued that Europe's economic recovery was necessary for world peace. And, Europe after World War II was in shambles. You can see from these pictures the devastation that happened throughout Europe. Factories after and during the war had been looted or bombed. There was little raw materials or power. Millions were out of work. There were many people in refugee camps. And so the idea was that we should offer some friendly aid, some friendly aid to help these countries get back on their feet. And while some thought it was too expensive, others favored it, fearing that communists might gain control of these economically weak countries. In February of 1948, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia with tanks and took over the country, and this is what pushed Congress to agree to approve the Marshall Plan. In all, you can see that the Marshall Plan gave out $12.5 billion, and you can see that France and the United Kingdom or Great Britain got the most, and other countries got quite a bit as well. You will notice, however, that the Eastern European countries don't have any of that cash. Why is that? Well, because the Soviet Union and the Eastern European nations refused the aid. They claimed it was a plot to get them dependent on the U.S., and so Stalin refused and convinced other groups or other countries also not to accept the aid. The secret words for today are spring break. Okay, let's move on to what happened in 1948 and 1949. This was the Berlin Airlift. Now you remember we talked about how Germany at the Potsdam Conference was divided into 4 zones: the United States, Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. And each of these countries ran their zones differently. The Soviets wanted to keep Germany weak so they couldn't attack again, and they also wanted to rebuild their own country. So they were actually taking resources out of East Germany and making East Germany even poorer and more run down than it was before. The other 3 countries, the United States, France, and Great Britain, decided to unite their zone, and they actually created a common currency. Their goal was the opposite. It was to strengthen Germany so it would be able to have a strong democracy. Now, what's interesting is that the capital of Germany is Berlin. That is located in the eastern part of Germany, so therefore it was located within the Soviet zone. The other 3 countries, the US, France, and Great Britain, did not want the Soviet Union to have total control of the capital, which is of course the most powerful and important city in the country. So Berlin was also divided into 4 zones. So they actually had controlled parts of the city that were in the eastern part of Germany. Now, and you can see here a picture of how West Berlin does so much better than East Berlin, because what are they getting? Marshall Plan aid, and they're getting money. And the western part of Berlin and West Germany were being rebuilt through this. Now, the problem arose for Stalin in Berlin because, this is a city, and people in Berlin, in the eastern part of Berlin, could see how prosperous the other sectors were compared to theirs. And in addition, Stalin did not like having these 3 countries in the capital and located in East Germany, so he wanted them out, but he didn't have the power. It was 1948. The United States had the atomic bomb. The Soviets did not at that point. So what he decided to do was to order the closing of all rail lines, canals, and roads that entered West Berlin through the Russian sector, basically isolating West Berlin. So that was a problem, because that meant that supplies of food and fuel were cut off, and the inhabitants of West Berlin only had enough food to last them for 36 days and coal for 45 days. The only way for the Allies to supply their sectors in Berlin was to actually fly in supplies. They knew this was safe because Stalin wouldn't dare to shoot down Allied planes with America's atomic supremacy. The flights lasted for 11 months until Stalin gave in. 327 days, 277,000 flights, 2.5 million tons of supplies. So it was quite impressive, and it was definitely a success because Stalin finally gave up. And here's a few more photos of all the supplies being delivered. Okay, moving on, let's talk about NATO and the Warsaw Pact. NATO, still around today. You might have heard about it in the news. This is an organization called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's basically a defensive military alliance. When this was set up, it was 15 countries which promised that an attack on one would be regarded as an attack on all. This included the United States, Canada, Iceland, and Western European nations. And this was created right after the Soviet advance into Czechoslovakia. Now, in response, not to be outdone, the Soviet Union created their own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact, and this included all those Eastern European satellite nations that were dominated by the Soviet Union. All of this, again, creating more tension in the Cold War. Then, to top it off, we have the nuclear arms race. This really gets started in 1949 when the Soviet Union achieves their own atomic bomb. And you can see the attractive scientist that created it. I know you will all want to grow, or at least the boys will want to grow a beard like that when you're older. All right, but that kicked off the nuclear arms race. And in response to that, the United States quadruples defense spending. Truman approved spending to develop even more powerful nuclear bombs. Now, Eisenhower, who becomes the president after Truman, continues this policy, and in 1952, the United States develops and tests the hydrogen superbomb in the Marshall Islands. This was quite a successful test. A fireball of the first test bomb reached a diameter of 3 miles, and it vaporized an entire island. It also destroyed all life and vegetation on surrounding islands. This was 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb. The Soviet Union amped up their efforts, and in 18 months they also had developed the hydrogen bomb. Again, more and more tension as the countries continue to build more nuclear weapons. All right, well, when the 1950s began, we saw some new leaders coming into play in the Cold War. In 1952, Eisenhower, you might remember him as the general from D-Day, is elected President of the United States. And in 1953, Stalin dies. This was kind of an interesting story. It was very controversial. Some people thought that he was poisoned. But that probably was not true because he made his advisors taste all of his food before he ate it. But he basically collapsed. His advisors, strangely, didn't get him medical care right away because they actually thought he had had too much to drink. And also, some may have wanted him dead. But finally, he was tended to by a major in his guard who was a veterinarian. So that was his medical care, and he did die. But this was a time when something called nuclear deterrence begins. Basically, it meant that the leaders, they don't want World War III. Tensions still extremely high, but neither side could afford a first strike because then the other would strike back and both would be destroyed. That was the power of these weapons. This concludes today's flipped lecture, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.